All right, welcome to another edition of South Philly Sauce, an Audacy original brought to you by 94 WIP and Jack Daniels. I'm Al Morganti, you know me, and I'm joined by a legend in the industry, Eric Duhatschek. I've known Eric forever from the days in Calgary, West Coast guy, member of the Hockey Hall of Fame, the Elman Ferguson Award, and Eric, you and I go back a long way. A lot of radio shows together, up in the other side of the 49th. So, welcome to this side of the 49th.
My pleasure, Alan. I'm glad I can finally return the favor because I know that all of my friends in Toronto growing up, the years that we were on radio in Toronto together, they loved it. I still get people wondering why we don't do work together. So I'm going to send them the link to this once it's posted and they can hear us gab back and forth like the old days.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff that's gone on. We've covered the league a long time, and I've been here in Philadelphia. And I'm watching the Flyers rebirth, and I'm wondering how it's playing throughout Canada, out west especially, and how important this franchise is to the league because they've sort of been absent for a while here, and it's really exciting in Philly to kind of see the team relevant again. What's it been like watching the Flyers from afar, if you will?
Well, one of the things I will tell you is that the respect for Daniel Briere is off the charts. And I think it's because, he's such a soft-spoken guy. And all of us that dealt with him as a player were, I think, impressed by his intellect. But, when you become a general manager for the first time, there's a tendency to be really conservative and to make sure that you have to win every trade. Most general managers take a long time to get their footing, and Daniel Briere has been the opposite. I mean, he arrived on the scene and he went out with guns a-blazing, and he's done wonderful work. And I think that an awful lot of teams, especially teams in Canada, where it just seems like there's this gridlock when it comes to player movement. Everybody's capped out. No one can do anything. There's a level of frustration in the various fan bases in Canada because teams don't seem to be doing enough. And then you look to Philadelphia and you see a manager that he's not making it look easy because it isn't easy, but he's getting work done. And lots of teams can't do it. So I think that the level of respect for Daniel Briere is, as I say, off the charts. I think people really think that he's going to be the next great general manager. And then in terms of John Tortorella, well, he's someone else that I've dealt with lots over the years and have always thought he was underrated as a coach. Everyone is always distracted by John's press conferences and the way he just fires from the hip. But deep down, he's a really effective hockey coach. And you just have to look at what's happened in Columbus since he's left. The franchise has just gone in the opposite direction. When John was there was a level of stability that hasn't been seen before or since. So I think and the grand scheme of things, when people from Canada look to the US and think about the key franchises, they think Original Six and they think Philadelphia. I think those are the ones that resonate the most with people up here. And the fact that the Flyers are a team that look as if they're going to make the playoffs when a lot of people thought that they might be, fighting for last place in the division. It's a remarkable story. And the trick will be, after all of the good feeling of this year, to make it happen again next year.
Yeah, I just came from the rink. They're heading to Chicago, and we waited, watch practice, and then Torts comes out, goes, hurry up, we have to make a plane. There was one question. He goes, okay, we're done, bye. I'm like, and you know what? For a lot of people, but I think he's reached that stage now where it's like, hey, we got Tortorella. Well, what are you going to do about it? So I do think that he's sort of earned that some kind of weird spot with even media who's like, you know what it'd be like usually. It's like, what is this? This is ridiculous. But it's like, oh yeah. Yeah, well, we'll go. We're along for the plan. So he kind of. I've seen other coaches do that later in their career, but never to this extent. This is remarkable to me.
Yeah, well, and what I'll tell you a John Tortorella story. A couple of years ago, I was in Calgary, and he was through, and I was working on a story on the development of NHL coaching and how it has evolved from the 50s and 60s, and speaking to people like Scotty Bowman and he seemed intrigued by the line of questioning, but he said, I don't want to do it here in a scrum. gave me his cell phone, called me at the hotel in the afternoon, and I'll have time to talk about it. And we spoke for a half an hour, 40 minutes. He talked about his background as a teacher and how, and how ultimately that's how he saw himself, as someone who was teaching players. But he was intrigued by the topic, and he had all the time in the world on a game day to speak about it. So, I was really impressed at the fact that he did that. And secondly, he really rounded out the piece with his comments. He's a smart, thoughtful guy, and that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, because a lot of other stuff that goes on. Well, he's also become, in a weird way, right here in Philadelphia. You mentioned Briere. We got Keith Jones, who's the club president, amazingly, to me, like I've come out of left field.
I was sitting beside him at your induction at the Hall of Fame. We spent hours talking back and forth. And then Dave Poulin was sitting on the other side of me, and now he's the number 2 in Ottawa. All we have to do is get Brian Engblom a job, and you've hit the home run.
I was like, I guess I hung with the right people. I guess I got tight with the right people. And Briere and you see what they made a terrific trade with LA. Their cap management is remarkable. You mentioned the smart front office, but we now head in toward a trade deadline. And John Tortorella, as much as any coach, has been really open about, we have some tough choices. Usually what it's like, they circle the wagons in the locker room, but Torts has been right out there. We have to make some tough decisions with players. That I'm thinking, wow, I've never seen this. Like, these basically, we have guys for sale in here. Despite the fact that we're going for the playoffs, he's acknowledging the tough decisions. And where do you think they're going to land on this? Because they've got some very, very viable candidates. Walker, obviously, Sealer. You can go down the line and go, man, there's some guys that really be attractive to other teams. Do you think that they're actually going to sell, even if they've got a playoff spot on the line?
I do, but I think a lot of times it's going to come down to price point. So this is one of the more complicated trade deadlines that I've seen, and I've covered 45 of them, or however long it's been. And but it's because every year at the trade deadline, it evolves into either a seller's market or a buyer's market. And the biggest problem is the mistakes of the past handful of years. Maybe mistakes is the wrong word, but so many teams in the past couple of years pushed in trade chips, and it didn't pay off in the Stanley Cup championship. So especially if you look at the Eastern Conference, Toronto needs one defenseman for sure, probably 2. Previous regime traded away every second round pick until the next century. So the type of trade chip that you would use if you're Toronto normally at the trade deadline, you don't have in your draft choice inventory. Tampa is the same. They gave up 5 picks for Tanner Jeannot. And so they simply don't have very much in the cupboard. So if you're Philadelphia, you think that based on what's happened in the past, the value for Sean Walker should be a first round pick. A lot of the teams that would be interested in someone like him don't have a first round pick to trade. So then it becomes, is it worth it to you, Philadelphia, to retain him as your own rental if you can't get your asking price? Or as you get closer to the deadline, does it become like a shopping sale on Black Friday? The price is a first round today, but tomorrow it might be a second round pick. So I think that that's what's going to happen. And I think that there will be a very busy flurry of deals right at the end, with teams having to evaluate. We didn't get what we wanted. Will we take a lesser deal, or will we simply say, no, we're going to retain our players? And I think that that's going to happen in half a dozen cities. And I think one of the reasons that you haven't seen a lot of action, there was that brief flurry. Calgary was involved in a trade, and Montreal was involved in a trade, and then it got silent again. It's because some general managers that I talk to are waiting to see if teams that were in it are out of it. And I'll give you an example of the Arizona Coyotes. So 3 weeks ago, the Coyotes were right there in the mix of teams that had a shot at making the playoffs. And it would have mattered to that organization to make the playoffs, because it's just been a terrible, terrible time of it on the ice. And they had a chance. They had a really good team going. Now they've gone into a nosedive, and suddenly the evaluation of a month ago is different than the evaluation today. Today, the evaluation is that we have Matt Dumba and we have Jason Zucker, who we signed last year and are rentals, and we probably are listening on them. So suddenly Dumba enters the trade conversation along with the two Philadelphia defensemen you talked about. Calgary's listening on Tanev, they're listening on Hanifin. So when you get more players in the mix, it gets harder and more complicated to sort out. So I think all of those guys are going to move at some point, but it's just a matter of whether the teams get what they think they can for them. Because in the past, I mean, first round picks for David Savard, first round picks for Ben Sherratt, you should, if you base it on historical precedent, you should be able to get that again. I don't think you're going to be able to this time around. Well,
the Flyers are interested, obviously, in what the Devils are going to do. And the Devils, obviously, the goaltender out where you've been, Calgary, Markstrom is like the candidate. And they really have a chance if they get a goaltender to, in the first place, take the Flyers out of a playoff spot, but then maybe make some noise in the playoffs. But I'm curious why it hasn't happened yet. It seems so logical. Is Calgary just trying to hold up the whole bank for him?
Yeah, no, I think it has a lot to do with salary retention. So Calgary, so the attraction of Markstrom is not only is he probably playing as well as any goaltender in the league right now, top 5 anyway, in terms of current performance. He's got a couple of years left at $6 million. That's a lot, but for a goaltender of his level, it's not an unreasonable sum of money. The problem in Calgary is that they are prepared to retain money on their rentals. So if you're shopping for Chris Tanev, if you sweeten the pot, Calgary will retain 50%. If you're shopping for Hanifin, they'll retain 50%. They don't want to retain money down the road on Markstrom because they have so much money committed already to Jonathan Huberdeau, $10.5 million, Nazem Kadri, $7 million, that it's difficult for them to take money back in the future years of a contract. So the situation as it relates to Markstrom's contract is different than it would be to the various rentals that they are offering. So I think that they might be prepared to retain a little bit on Markstrom, but as I understand it, the deal broke down on how much New Jersey wanted Calgary to retain on Markstrom, and it didn't get much further than that because I think Calgary said, okay, we're prepared to go to this point and no further. And my understanding is that we do have a little bit of time before the trade deadline, so now it's a matter of does New Jersey want to reflect on the impact that he might have on their team and change their position. I mean, every trade is a negotiation, and negotiation involves multiple moving parts. And so I think that depending again on, I don't think they would trade a Simon Nemec, but I think for someone like that, Calgary would retain whatever they had to get a player of that caliber. If you're talking about a Dawson Mercer or a Holtz, at that point, yeah, those are also interesting players from Calgary's perspective, but then they're not going to take as much money back. So there's a push-pull in all of these negotiations, which is why it's different than you and I trying to make a trade in fantasy hockey, and why sometimes these things die and then are revisited. And so I'm convinced that at some point it will be revisited, but whether it will be successfully concluded, I couldn't predict.
I think it'll get there. I'm pretty sure with knowing what Jersey's got to get through the disappointment if they don't get there this year is going to be, it's really going to set them back for what their fans thought was going to happen. In the meantime, out west, another guy that from Philly, Rick Tocchet. It's amazing the tough guys that I covered to turn into really good coaches. Craig Berube, I just talked to the last couple of days, and now Tocchet, whose team had a bizarre loss last night in Minnesota, just crazy. But when I look at Vancouver and I look at Tocchet, I talk to Tocchet sometimes, and despite their record, he's got misgivings about sometimes the way they play, and I guess it showed up with the Minnesota game. But how did Vancouver become so good this year? Well, despite some of the analytics numbers, when you look at it, and some of you wonder how much their star player, Elias Pettersson, is even kind of in tune with what's going on. Is that a mirage there? But the longer I get in the season, the more it looks like they could be a real playoff threat.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the biggest differences between Vancouver at the start of this season and Vancouver last year early, when Bruce Boudreau was still coaching there, is goaltending. And Thatcher Demko, again, we're talking about a guy that I believe this year has been in the top 3 goaltenders in the National Hockey League, and he's been healthy. And I remember watching Jimmy Rutherford's first press conference when he got to Vancouver, and he made a point of saying the one thing about rebuilding this organization and this franchise is we have the goaltending solved. And Demko was in his mind a guy that was going to be a difference maker going forward, and he was signed for a reasonable money, and he was at an age where he was going to play for a long time. And then injuries came along, and he just wasn't, he missed a lot of time last year, and they never found a proper replacement for him. And then he eventually came back at the end of the season. But of course, by then they'd made the coaching change and Rick Tocchet was there. And I think that what you see happening with Vancouver now started already at the point where Tocchet's voice came in and he was the right voice for that team. And Demko came back to full health and really found his game again in the final 6 weeks. So they were in garbage time. No one was paying very much attention to them at all. A lot of times we don't want to read too much into garbage time because lots of times players can play at a certain level when there's no pressure, and then suddenly the pressure's on at the start of a season, and suddenly they're not the same. But I think the biggest single difference there is that they have had outstanding goaltending. And I'm sure you looked to see who played goal in that 10-7 game, and it wasn't Thatcher Demko, right? It was Casey DeSmith. So that makes a big difference. I mean, once in a while, he needs to get a game off, and he did yesterday. And so I think that's a big reason why they're a lot better. Now, having said that, Quinn Hughes is a terrific defenseman. I think he's probably had the best year of all those young defensemen coming up, even better than Cale Makar, which is saying something. He's managed to find a way of getting the most out of JT Miller. Brock Besser is another guy who's had lots of injuries and lots going on in his life. And this year, he just seems to be playing with a clear head. And for a while, he was among the top 5 goal scorers in the league. So, a lot of times, you always imagine worst case scenarios for teams, but sometimes you get a best case scenario. Philly's a great example of a team where pretty much every best case scenario is unfolding. And that's what's happened in Vancouver. But I mean, I love Tocchet as a coach. We all go back with Rick for, to his playing days. And, he's a player's coach because, the way he played, you garner so much respect in the dressing room. The tough guys love him because he was a tough guy. The skilled guys loved him because he was a skilled guy. It's very rare that you get a coach that checks all of those boxes. I think Gerard Gallant was a little bit like that. I think that, I remember somebody telling me that, I think it was Willie Mitchell about, what made Gerard Gallant so good. Well, he was a good player at the National Hockey League level, but he also played with an edge. And so players in the dressing room could relate to the way Gallant was as a player. And I think they can relate to what Tocchet was as a player. And the example that Tocchet's playing career set. I mean, he's not a guy that's, that never played in the league and says, go out and do this. He's a guy that played in the league and said, go out and do this. And I did it. So if I can do it, you can do it, or you should do it. So his message has really resonated with that group. So those two things, Rick Tocchet's coaching, and by the way, I think he is the coach of the year, and the goaltending of Thatcher Demko, that's what's turned Vancouver around in a meaningful way.
So you have Tocchet 1 and Tortorella 2.
Yeah, they're the two best coaches this year. And having said that, that we don't vote for those of us in the Professional Hockey Writers Association. We vote for 5 of the major awards. The Coach of the Year is not one that we vote for, and I have always taken issue sometimes with the way the broadcasters have voted, because they often give the award to the coach that has overseen the biggest single season jump in production. And therefore, a lot of very good coaches on very good teams get overlooked year after year after year. Like, how many times should John Cooper have won it and hasn't? But I do think in this particular case that you just can't overlook the impact that Rick Tocchet has had on that team. And he's just flat out made a huge difference there.
And the Flyers have managed to make the elite players really elite. When they lose, it's a hat trick by a McKinnon or Panarin, or it goes on and on. It was lost in Matthews most recently, and Matthews, I mean, hat trick after hat trick after hat trick, and everybody's looking at Ovechkin with the Gretzky record. Is it out of line to think that this guy, before it's done, I'm sure he's going to be the all-time leader with Leafs, has a chance to be the all-time leading goal scorer in the history of the league, that the pace he's going at?
Well, I think ultimately it comes down to longevity, and and I just don't really know how long Austin Matthews wants to play. So he would have to produce at this level year after year after year after year to get even in the conversation. So is it possible? Maybe, but I just think that's first of all, I think Ovechkin is going to play long enough to get Gretzky's record.
Yeah.
I think he'll play until he's 50 if he has to get that record. And I'm not sure that Austin Matthews, who by the way has, like he is, a rink rat, and he's a guy that cares more about the game. You see him, and he has kind of a sometimes a kind of a goofy public personality, but he's a committed hockey player. He is a committed hockey player. I've spoken to Brad Treliving, the manager there in Toronto, the new manager in Toronto, who used to run Calgary, and he just raves about how committed this guy is to being a better professional night after night after night. And you can see it. I mean, how do people like Austin Matthews excel, or Connor McDavid? Because not only do they have the talent, but they work at it. You have to have both of those things. So he does love the game. He wants to play the game, but is he the type of guy who, once he gets to the age of 35 and starts to see some slippage, does he want to continue on? And that's a part of the equation that you can't answer. Like Joe Thornton wanted to play until he was 50. Yager, Chelios, these guys, yeah. They couldn't even imagine a life without the game, and you had to take them away from the game, pulling and screaming. And there are others that that at a point in their careers where they're not at that level of achievement, that they realize it's time. And so I think that's what will ultimately determine with Matthews. One, he has to keep up a phenomenal pace. Two, he has to stay healthy. That's another thing that Ovechkin's been able to do. And then three, he has to find the motivation probably between the ages of 35 and 40 to press on. And it's just impossible to predict whether that will ever happen or not. Especially
with $3 billion in the bank.
Exactly.
Go there. And finally, want to wrap up with we had the outdoor, the Stadium Series game. Now, I was a little reticent about all these outdoor games. Like, is it going to work? Man, did it ever work in New York? Mm-hmm. It really did. And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm actually thinking, why can't, it sounds dumb, but why not have a tournament, like an outdoor thing, into the regular season schedule? I mean, it was very, very exciting. I know it's weather dependent and all, but I'll tell you, the amount, I believe that they almost got locally, I'm not talking about the entire nation, but locally, as much attention to hockey as an Olympic tournament. Mm-hmm. Every major media outlet was on this, and all the players from other sports were involved in it. But I'm at the point now where I almost consider a yearly game in the New York area, because it gets as much attention locally, not talking like overall, as an Olympic tournament. Do you think there'll be any appetite for that in the league?
Well, I think the word you use there that is most appropriate is local. So every time there's an outdoor game in your market, it resonates. I know in Edmonton, they had the game before Christmas. It was a smash. It was the 20th anniversary of the first outdoor game, and I wondered. I was in Canada, but I'd come down to the States prior to that, and no one down here seemed to care, but everyone in Edmonton did. And everyone in Calgary cares when they have an outdoor game. I was at the outdoor game at Dodger Stadium just before the Olympics in Sochi, and it was a fantastic event. So I think that what the National Hockey League has learned is that while there isn't a lot of national interest anymore in these outdoor games, locally they resonate with the fan base, with the city. It's like bringing the Shriners to town. It's like a convention. And as you say, a lot of people that maybe don't care about hockey care about it because it's an event. So yeah, but I don't see anything really changing. I think that they're content with the path that they're on with outdoor games. They don't want to have too many. I think one of the things that they did well there was it takes a lot of time and effort to produce the ice for an outdoor game. So if you're going to go to the time and trouble, playing them back to back as they did made a lot of sense. Now, could you play 4 instead of 2? And would people care about the third game? Maybe not. But they're on the right track, and I don't see anything changing there. But they're fun in your community, and if it's somewhere else, then you can tune it out. I wonder how many people in the New York area are going to care about the Columbus game, right? Probably not.
No,
Not
no.
that many.
Want to thank Eric Duhatschek for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in to South Philly Sauce and Audacy Original, brought to you by 94 WIP and Jack Daniels. Ashlyn Sullivan will return. We'll be back with another episode on Friday.